Hello, this is Tim from Vintage RC Garage. This is the third video of my three-part series about the Tamiya Lunchbox. In the first video, we did a detailed unboxing of the Vintage Lunchbox 5863. In the second video, we did a detailed comparison of the vintage versus re-release box content. Today, we're going to build the Tamiya Lunchbox Re-Release kit number 58347 from start to finish. Make sure you don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you will get all my new content. Okay, let's get started. Make sure you have a 2-channel radio with receiver, steering servo, and electronic speed controller ready to go before you get started. I didn't get my speed controller in the mail until after I started the video, so I will be installing that later in the video. We will start with the steering servo saver. Make sure you use the correct servo head for your servo manufacturer and make sure your servo is in the neutral position before attaching. This will make it easier to adjust the steering later. One of the things I like to do is organize my screw bags so that it's easier to find parts later. Group them by bag and do your best to keep them in piles. Even better is find some small shallow trays and use them to hold each bag. Another thing I like to do is pull out all the parts needed for the given step before I start. This way I can verify counts and it helps me make sure that I don't miss installing any parts along the way. Start by attaching the servo ball connectors to the servo head and attaching the servo saver to the servo. Make sure that the servo points straight down perpendicular to the servo and secure it with the proper screw type for your servo brand. Could be a self-tapping or a machine screw. Next, attach your servo mount blocks to the servo. These will be what you attach the servo to the chassis with later. After the servo is squared away, pull out the chassis and attach the body mounts. The Lunchbox has a unique side clip mount for the body van, and also unique is the chrome parts used to attach the body clips. When you clip the chrome parts from the part street, it's crucial that you use a good pair of low-profile snips to reduce the leftover material as much as possible. Since the parts are chrome plated, you cannot sand down rough spots without ruining the chrome finish. When mounting the front steering servo, position the servo head toward the front left side of the chassis and tilt it at a slight angle in line with the chassis. Then screw in the tapping screws to the servo mount blocks. Pull out the radio receiver and double-sided tape and attach the receiver to the chassis. Make sure the antenna wires will reach to the antenna location and are on the left side of the chassis so it sticks through the van body. Next, pull out the on-off switch sticker and position it on the side of the chassis for easy visibility. Take the time to position the sticker straight. Attention to these small details make a huge difference in the final product. Let's start assembling the gearbox. One key point is to make sure you liberally grease all parts required. Once assembled, it is very difficult to gain access to most parts, so do yourself a favor and do it right the first time. I chose not to purchase the hop-up for full bearings. If you plan to run your RC a lot, it's usually a good idea to spend the extra money to do it up front, since replacing bearings can be a time-consuming task to disassemble everything in order to gain access for a bearing replacement. For me, making a nice-looking kit is always a priority. When you clip a tree part that will be externally visible, I prefer to sand the nubs flat. I do this by using a good side cutter to clip the part, and then use a metal file or X-Acto knife to remove large burrs. I finish the process with a multi-grit sanding stick to get the part scratch-free and back to its original shine. Go ahead and start the gearbox assembly with the grease access port and the bearings. Repeat the other side of the gearbox sanding, greasing, and assembling. Before closing up the gearbox, make sure you assemble the rear differential. The gear pins need to be fully seated into the main gear and everything needs to be liberally greased before inserting it into the gearbox. When screwing in the self-tapping screws, make sure you do not over-tighten them. If you do use an electric screwdriver, I recommend not screwing them all the way in and then finish them with a hand tighten so you can feel when it's time to stop. As is typical with the different shapes of plastic, different parts need different force to complete the tightening, and once you strip the threads, it's all over, so take your time and do it right. The motor's next. Make sure the pinion gear is properly gapped according to the instructions using the provided paper gapper in order to assure the proper alignment with the spur gear. When applying the motor wire strap, I recommend loosely tightening the strap to the motor and not clipping the excess until after the motor is installed and you have a better idea where your speed control wires are best routed. When attaching the motor, make sure it is positioned correctly. The pinion gear is off center from the motor mount, and if not properly positioned toward the main gear, it will not make contact and you will need to fix it later. Also, when attaching the shock mounts to the gearbox, I recommend hand tightening these screws since the tapping screws appeared extremely strippable if they were tightened too much. The wheelie bar is attached to the back of the gearbox. Make sure you pull the correct wheel part. I made the mistake of using a white gear bearing in the video when in fact it should be from the black deep tree parts, which I had to fix later. Attaching the gearbox to the chassis was a bit unusual. Make sure to grease and position the gearbox bar into the side mounts. The instructions use a temporary screw to hold back the springs until properly positioned into the chassis, and then they're removed. This makes it easier to align the gearbox bar while inserting the side mounts to the chassis. It took me a few attempts to get this configured correctly. I would recommend securing one side of the box mount and then let the other side slide in and out so there is less moving parts when securing it to the chassis. When complete, remove the temporary screws. Next up are the rear shocks. You need to cut the 4 18mm rubber sleeves for each of the shocks. Do this now with a pair of good scissors or X-Acto knife. Try to make the cuts as straight as possible. There is enough extra tubing to make sure the ends are trimmed straight between cuts. Grease the shock shafts and position the parts in order according to the manual. Make sure the shock chamber is positioned with the large opening up toward the chassis. I found it easier to secure the lock nut up to the rubber tubing, then use a screwdriver from the top to tighten the nut and the entire assembly to prevent spinning. Snap the rear shocks onto the chassis using the shock mounts attached to the gearbox, then move on to the battery compartment. Make a clean sanded tree cut and attach the foam to reduce battery movement while running. Attach the ball connectors to the steering rods using a soft pair of pliers to prevent scratching the metal. An old t-shirt around a pair of pliers will also do the job if you don't have the soft tip pliers. The left and right steering rods are different lengths, so make sure you measure the distance between the ball connectors accurately using a good ruler. The battery is secured with a swing out arm that connects with a clip. This part can be installed multiple ways incorrectly, so make sure it swings the correct direction and the tapered end is positioned correctly at the clip point. The battery compartment easily attaches to the chassis with a few self-tapping screws. Complete the front steering by clipping the front steering protection guard from the parts tree and snapping on the steering rods to the servo head. Remember that they are different lengths and that the longer one goes on the side where the servo head is furthest from the wheel. Then secure the steering protection guard. At this point, verify that the servo head is mounted in the neutral position so that the steering travel can be performed equally in both directions. Thanks for watching part A of this Lunchbox re-release build. Today we completed the chassis up to the front steering. Check out part B of this build where we complete the rest of the chassis and we will finish the body shell and traditional Tamiya box art from start to finish. See you next time.